Good morning, Hassan Huskies. This is your principal, Dr. Miller, and today is Monday, December 12th, 2022. Please stand with me and say the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, today is Monday, December 12th, and we have a lot of fun things planned for this week. Third grade, some of you have had your Nutcracker performance and 2 more performances this week. Super exciting. We had our family picnic on Friday, and then I hope all of you had a really good weekend. A huge shout out and thank you to Mrs. Greenwald and the PTO for another successful book fair and all the fun things that are happening at Hassan. Today is Monday, so we're gonna do birthdays. And we're gonna start with the half birthdays for our summer birthday babies. All right, so we have a lot of names. December babies, we have Murphy Kane in Miss Peterson's class, Jasmine Kunkel in Mrs. Craig's class, Jace Dorn in Mrs. Lochner's class, Max Baldwin in Miss Peterson's class, Olivia in Miss Stemick's class, Jasmine in Miss Craig's class, Kellen in Mrs. Dazowski's class, Liam in Mrs. Cedargrim's class, Addison in Mrs. Stemick's class, Elliot in Mrs. Spalding's class, and Landon in Mrs. Klein's class. Additionally, we have half birthdays, so we have quite a few because we are starting them now. So we have Gada in Miss Stemick's class, Winifred in Mrs. Hamilton's class, Jazaria in Mrs. Spears' class, Journey in Mrs. Back's class, Collins in Miss Hamilton's class, Riley in Mr. Spitzek's class, June in Mr. Spitzek's class, Leo in Mrs. Solberg's class, Lucy in Mrs. Hamilton's class, Foster in Mr. Willenbring's class, Kane in Miss Christensen's class, Nima in Miss Edie's class, Lex in Miss Edie's class, Carter in Mrs. Cedargrin's class, Levi in Mrs. Spears' class, Kaylee in Mrs. Greenwald's class, Jakari in Miss Doro's class, Levisi in Mrs. Cedargrin's class, Hunter in Mrs. Doro's class, Grace in Miss Dockendorf's class, Zephy in Mrs. Dazowski's class, Marshall in Mrs. Haren's class, Evelyn in Mrs. Hamilton's class, Colton in Mrs. Sylvester's class, Lydia in Mrs. Hines' class, Evelyn in Mrs. Dazowski's class, Keegan in Mrs. Stella's class, Oliver in Mrs. Back's class, Charlotte in Mrs. Greenwald's class, Grayson in Mr. Willenbring's class, Thomas in Mrs. Stemick's class, David in Mrs. Spalding's class, Grant in Mrs. Back's class, Ty in Mrs. Doro's class, Charlotte in Mrs. Greenwald's class, Miriam in Mrs. Sylvester's class, Olivia in Mrs. Sylvester's class, Finley in Mrs. Sylvester's class, James in Mrs. Hines' class, Amelia in Mrs. Spalding's, Rugatu Ba in Mrs. Cedargrin's class, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, sweetie, Addison in Mrs. Edie's class, Zoe in Miss Rowland's class, Matthew in Mrs. Haren's class, Eli in Mrs. Stella's class, Chase in Mrs. Klein's class, Owen in Mr. Spitzek's class, Parker in Mr. Willenbring's class, Lily in Mrs. Wallen's class, Layton in Mrs. Wallen's class, Brody in Mrs. Dazowski's class, Lucia in Mrs. Sylvester's class, and Taylor in Miss Rowland's class. Happy birthday! Teachers, I will ask Erin to give you a copy of the list of students so that you can make sure that your kids get to come on down. Kids, listen to your teachers, and when they tell you it's a good time, please come join us in the office for a birthday book and a birthday pencil. Happy Monday, everybody. Make it a great week.